You're live, Kirsten.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for the opportunity to join you at the end of what is obviously a very rich and full symposium. My name is Kirsten Dunlop. I'm the Chief Executive of an organization called EIT Climate Kick. And I'm just going to put that up on screen so that you can see the logo and the name and get started. I'm here to talk with you this evening about the role of finance and the economy in revolutionizing sustainability. And I'll explain why and the work that we are doing and where I'm speaking from. But I want to start by setting a context, one that I know I'm sure has been the context for the last 2 days of this symposium. But I think it's very important perhaps just to close out the event with a restatement about the situation in which we're in. We have badly underestimated both the speed and the extent of climate change. And in particular, our analysis has failed to pay attention to what are called the tipping points of the climate system. So put simply, global warming and climate change feedback effects are happening much, much faster than we've anticipated. We have failed to meet the 1999 UNFCCC objectives. Dangerous climate change is already occurring at about 1.3 degrees of global average increase in surface temperature relative to pre-industrial levels. Ecosystems cannot adapt to this naturally. Food production is threatened. Economic development is not proceeding in a sustainable manner, and far from precautionary steps are being taken to avert adverse climate impact. To make matters worse, the ongoing expansion of fossil fuel use and fossil fuel investment is still being contemplated, and that accelerates the impacts. So in other words, if we really pay attention to the latest body of scientific evidence, it looks as if 1.5 degrees will occur now around about 2030, irrespective of the actions that we take in the interim. And that makes the upper 2-degree limit most likely to happen around about 2050. Even with actions better than the current Paris commitments, 3 degrees is likely early to midway through the second half of this century. We know that 1.3 degrees is already dangerous. We are experiencing that right now. We've experienced it all summer. 2 degrees would be extremely dangerous. 3 degrees is catastrophic. And if we need a reminder, if the implications of that haven't sunk in yet, we have a global pandemic giving us a glimpse of what that might mean, and a glimpse of what it means to experience the characteristics of this kind of change: systemic, complex, adaptive, fundamentally uncertain. Who knew that a virus crossing a species in one market, in one city, in one country would lead to a major regression in gender equality for women, or the price of shipping container freight increasing by more than 400%, or an unprecedented development in collaboration between competitors in the global pharmaceutical industry, and a demonstration even for a few months of what it means to reduce emissions by 7% in 1 year, something that we will have to repeat year on year for the next 10 to get anywhere near what we require to stay within livable global warming. So money is flowing faster now. That penny is dropping. The realization is there. It's flowing in greater quantities and flowing from a greater diversity of sources and institutions. Industry is moving. All of that is good. It's still crazily small proportions. Sustainable bonds are still about 8 to 10% of the bond market globally, given the size and the costs of the risks we face. But the question I'm here to discuss this evening is, money is flowing, but into what? And when we say sustainability, what are we talking about? What are we still seeking to sustain? We are still iterating on a broken system. And it is long time to see that, acknowledge it, and go back to the drawing board of our financial system on a number of misleading ideas and assumptions, starting with capitalism itself, materialism, the principle of the invisible hand, and on our underlying economic thinking. So what I would like to do is give you an example of what do I mean by that? Who am I? Where am I speaking from? What are we doing? I live and work in a world that deals with and develops innovation, climate innovation. This is a European organization. It is funded by the European Commission through the European Institute of Innovation and Technology. And it's focused on the development of new solutions, new ideas, new technologies, coming both from universities, from tech transfer, from industry, but also from SMEs, entrepreneurs, micro SMEs, and so on. We chose about 4.5 years ago to shift, to pivot our business model. And I'm going to explain why, and to pivot the value proposition to focus on two things: a response to climate change that is commensurate with the scale and the complexity of the challenge, and therefore a focus on systemic change and a focus on reaching regenerative industries and regenerative societies as quick as possible. Decarbonization, climate neutral economies and cities by 2030. We're literally about to start leading the boldest change program actually in the world at the moment, with a commitment of 200 cities in Europe to get to decarbonization by 2030. We're an organization that has a long track record in the standard practices of innovation. We were started in the end of 2009, beginning of 2010. We've worked to incubate startups. We have about 15 or so of the Forbes 30 under 30 pretty much every year come from the Climate Kick shop. We have leveraged a significant amount of funding and follow-on funding, raised funding around startups, created some of the household names in climate technology solutions, energy solutions, mobility, transport, food systems, food provision for foods for salmon farming, for fish farming, for insect protein, agricultural land use, and so on. Our startups alone our innovation projects alone have produced around about 13 million tons of carbon dioxide emissions avoided per year since 2010. So, okay, we have done a lot. We've produced a lot. We've supplied a lot to market. But we've also learned a lot about what is not happening as a result of the model with which we have been working and the world in which we're operating, in particular the world of resources flowing in to climate innovation and to climate solutions. And that's why I come back to the question of what are we putting the money into and what are we sustaining? Our learnings are the world in which we operate is a world, for example, that asks me to apply constantly a competitive logic to innovation, to welcome a bunch of ideas, search far and wide, build the conditions for developing good ideas, but then come up with criteria to funnel them in and choose the best solutions. Usually they are defined as the most profitable and therefore the most appealing to market, because that's perceived to be the most effective way to achieve change in our capital market system. The most impactful in terms of emissions avoided, if I'm dealing with an impact-aligned funder, but that's calculated ex ante and in the abstract because many of these things haven't been tried yet. And possibly most limiting of all, I'm asked to choose proposals and solutions that are most aligned to project finance expectations or the investment theses or grant or funding theses of whomever is providing the resource, which usually means I need to choose projects that have clear and demonstrable deliverables, bankable assets, single bankable assets, usually with visible outcomes, quick wins in the short term, and even more ideally with a neat profit projected as the overarching indicator of success in a world, our world, in which change is all about market-induced financial flows. And yet our understanding, our learning from these years of acting to produce a supply of innovation and push them into market is that when we are asking for that, we are asking innovation to iterate on the existing system, on our current ideas about prosperity, about effectiveness, about success and growth, and we know that that system is broken. So, of course, we use success criteria for what good looks like in the world that we know now. But we're supposed to be coming up with a world that we don't know now, that is really well beyond our experience and our existing criteria. And our experience is when you run this model of innovation, you get investment agendas and project finance looking for discrete investable projects, and you end up with disconnected, siloed, sectoral innovations that do not join up and that produce ultimately incremental change. So the challenge we set ourselves is, what are we using innovation to do and how are we designing it to achieve that? And the number one design challenge is climate change is a systemic problem, and it's a systemic problem with complex adaptive characteristics, fundamentally, quite apart from the characteristics of the natural world that we need to regenerate, but because we are really talking, when we're talking about climate change, at the need to change human systems. This is about social transformation and social change and the underlying assumptions for our design for life that we need to change. And with it, all of the economics, our economic thinking, our assumptions about the value of time, our assumptions about our right to exploit the environment in which we live, and so on. So this is what we set about doing. We set about saying we need a mechanism for innovation that is coherent with the nature of the problem, that is responding to the fact that we need to change systemically, we need to catalyze social systems change, economic systems, policy, regulatory, financial systems, and therefore we need to design it differently. And when I mean that, I mean we literally act on every single possible movable lever. So that meant we started to shift our model. We shifted towards starting with the gap between where we are now and what we might need to achieve in any single relationship that we're working with. And here we are shifting, we have shifted our relationships to partner with city governments, with national, regional governments, with large corporates embedded in global value chains. We've started to shift towards understanding what is at stake in systemic terms. What are the systems at play in any one city? And really start to think in terms of intervention points, sensitive intervention points or acupuncture points that could catalyze a dynamic of change. Think in terms of leverage points. We understand that this is about designing innovation for uncertainty, which means a portfolio approach, not assuming that we're in the market to try and find a winning solution, because every single one of the solutions we find is an incomplete part of the puzzle. What we need to do is put them all together. And we really need to work on the principle that this is about harnessing innovation to learn how to fundamentally change our infrastructure, our planning, our regulation, our policy, our energy systems, our food systems, and so on. So in 2019, we went live. We went with a beta model. We launched something called Deep Demonstrations, really principally to try and bring to life also or address this problem of seeing is believing. We are creatures that require images and representations to move towards, to understand what alternatives look like, literally. And we know that the challenge is individual living labs, perfectly tech-fitted houses that do amazing energy efficiency and food systems and waste recycling on university campuses is very, very hard to correlate with what it would take to decarbonize entire messy cities out there. So we launched the concept of deep demonstrations, and we reached out to governments and to corporates all over and to community organizations all over Europe and asked for those who felt that they were worried enough to try to get in with us and understand how could we design and deploy innovation differently to catalyze systemic change. We have about 25 of those agreements. I'm going to give you an example of what this looks like on the ground, and then I'm going to come back to what is needed from finance, from public and private finance on all sides of the spectrum in the financial services system. This is us working in cities, and it's not just us, but a community of partners. We represent about 2,000 organizations working in different kinds of relationships together. If you are dealing with a large-scale city, and I'm going to give you an example of one of the cities that we're working with, you need to look for how to address all of these elements together. Sequentially, it doesn't really work. Sectorally, we're leaving massive cost opportunities on the table and replicating costs over and over. Because, for example, let's take a real city. The digital, this is the city of Madrid with whom we are partnered. The objective here is to move forward to decarbonization as quickly as possible. Hard to see, I apologize. That's actually quite hard to see. But let's take the methodological approach. We start by saying, okay, in a city, we know that, for example, the digital infrastructure that is needed to create energy efficiency, waste treatment, and water management within homes is the same digital infrastructure that we need for in-home healthcare. And in this particular portfolio, there's quite a concern with social cohesion, with mobility, with community connection, with transport, with energy infrastructure, and with regulatory sandboxes and the rewilding of solutions. So if we could treat those together, we can solve for aging populations in European cities where in-home healthcare is an absolute cost imperative, cost-saving imperative, but it's also an opportunity to reconnect communities around a much greater sense of social and emotional well-being. Once we start to add into this same portfolio approach nature-based solutions and rewilding, we can start to introduce urban farming, which reduces food systems instability, logistics and supply chain instability. It rebuilds community cohesion and connectedness. It improves air quality. It manages water and waste significantly more effectively. And it starts to change the underlying land value of the properties, because you're dealing at that point in property that is addressing energy efficiency, waste, water, air quality changes, and kind of a requalification of well-being, of social cohesion, community connection, mental and emotional well-being, and huge healthcare savings. And you start to get into a very, very interesting world of redesign of the fabric of life, with multiple cash flows, non-necessarily correlated, and changes in underlying value, changes in the quality of real estate portfolios, changes in forward planning, and so on. That's the kind of world we're describing with this sort of work. It starts with agreeing a commitment, an intent to achieve this kind of radical transformation. It works through a process of mapping and understanding what is actually at play, what are the systems that need to be addressed, and where are they locked in to change to assumptions or policies or regulation that are very, very difficult to handle. It works on the principle that innovation is the best possible mechanism we have for managing uncertainty. So it intervenes to activate a portfolio of 100 different diverse solutions connected up into all sorts of different sectors and silos, intervening on leverage points everywhere. And most importantly, it runs the whole portfolio as an active learning system, interrogating every single one of these experiences, connecting them to each other, looking for combinations. Very often nature-based solutions and energy, very rarely looked at together, all of a sudden create combinatory solutions. And it translates that experience into policy intelligence to help decision-making and resource allocation. And the question is, how does the resource allocation work? This is another example working with a regional government, looking at how to bring together a whole body of work in the Basque Country around social cohesion, equality, and solidarity with the challenges of decarbonizing industry and of anticipating climate changes in heat, in storm surge, in sea level rise, in forestry degradation, in the design of solutions already. And this kind of portfolio logic helps us both place innovations, connect innovations, and, if possible, bring in finance to engage in those terms. And we are about to lead one of the European Commission programs, the Green Deal Pilot Program, a prototype for the mission on cities, which is about implementing these kinds of approaches within cities in Europe, with a significant amount of first loss guarantee seed funding from the Commission, but a huge need for funding to come in alongside at great orders of magnitude to support this kind of work. And that's where it gets tricky, because one of the things that we've learned is that it's incredibly difficult to draw resource of all types into a portfolio approach, into the notion of really addressing intersectoral challenges, massive, wicked, intractable problems for changing the world in ways that are coherent and commensurate with those challenges. So we've launched something called the Transformational Capital Initiative, which is an initiative seeking to create a collaborative space for funding multi-asset class, place-based, real economy portfolios, whereby a portfolio here represents a whole city or multiple cities. In the case of net zero cities, potentially 200 cities whose procurement and planning starts to change, whose sense of the materials and the quantum of materials needed, who are stress testing and rapidly experimenting on the ground with solutions and combinations of solutions that work. Transformational capital is a way of looking at how do we get a systemic way of thinking about innovation to drive and support systemic change, which is what we know we need to do anything like the degree, the scale, and the complexity of transformation we need in the next 10 years. How do we get that mobilized in the world of finance? And here we are really trying to bring together finance practice and systems thinking with use cases to prototype on. The Gipuzkoa example I gave you is in the Basque Country. The work we're doing in Slovenia is on circular economy. cities, the healthy, clean cities thing, Madrid is sitting within that example. The key concepts here are how to create an investment structure that is resisting the temptation to dig down deep and look for the single bankable assets and the ventures, but invests in the portfolio itself, invests in the principle of the portfolio as being the best possible chance we have of pulling through the real options that we actually really need then to change. And this is about building budgets of flexibility and possibility, building a set of space of options that can be invested in once we've learned. So starting to really build in the whole principle of the portfolio, using that mechanism as a way of accelerating learning. It also means nesting financial capital in a series of other drivers for change, and then looking to, and then looking to put around it an intelligence gathering system that drives the experience of innovation straight back up into investment theses and investment choices. But it's staging through the choice to put funding into the process of learning and connecting and forcing systems change, or encouraging systems change and attractors. In practice, what does it look like in relationship to traditional sustainable finance? This is real economy work. It's focused on value generation and capture, on the building of new markets. It's a shift towards a change in system dynamics and actively investing in system dynamics. It's very much looking for portfolio effects, the sum being greater than the whole being greater than the sum of the parts rather than individual transactions. It's investing in strategic portfolios, and it's therefore what we would define as transformational ROI. So it requires an entirely new set of metrics. The agency of past capital here is active. The role of the investor is proactively engaged in the learning and sense-making, but its underpinning epistemology is aligned with and commensurate, coherent, as I have said several times, with the nature of the challenge we're working on and the type of change we need to achieve. And that does make it a rather different proposition. Now, we've put out a white paper on this. What we are doing is prototyping it, starting in Switzerland with a small donation to start building, or a donation from the Migros Pioneer Fund to start building the prototype for what do you actually put your money in? How does this investment mechanism work? I'm going to stop sharing and then move on to the last part of this presentation, which was a reflection on, there is a large worked example of the kind of work to achieve the kind of change we need for the complexity and scale of transformation and the complexity and scale of the challenge that we face. There are 5 things that we have learned that are significant barriers and obstacles to connecting the resources in the world and the growing awareness of emergency and the growing interest of investing and placing public money, private money, investment capital, first loss guarantee, institutional capital. 5 things that are really getting in the way, and 5 things that I would suggest seeking to try or accelerate. If I can leave you with a provocation on things to consider as major institutions in the financial services system. The 5 misleading ideas that are really, really getting in our way now, and that will effectively constitute the sands into which our efforts run in the next 10 years if we cannot move beyond them or think outside of them. The first is the idea that humans live by goods and services. Materialism, consumption as the core tenet of our capital markets system. The idea that our well-being depends upon that rather than upon empowerment, on the ability to shape our destiny and our means, and that our well-being actually depends on care for others, on being socially connected. COVID has begun to show us that in very material ways, in very substantial ways. But we are still working with a system that seconds empowerment and social connection to extractive consumption and waste. Secondly, the social value of self-interest, the idea that the principle that underlies the principle of the invisible hand that underlies so much of it, the idea that the pursuit of self-interest will lead people to support the interests of the whole. that it isn't necessarily completely wrong, but it ignores the fact that trust is required for that. Trust at scales that do not correspond to the global system. And we see that increasingly in the fragmentation of the world that we're living in. The third misleading idea is what we did with the discovery of longitude. The idea that time is money and that instantaneity, time approximating zero, is the indicator of increased value. As a result of which we have an entire financial system that systematically discounts the future in favor of the present. From the way in which we think about discounted accounting to the way in which we think about cost-benefit analysis and the way in which we structure our long-term institutional and patient capital. The fourth misleading idea, and I know that this is a big way of framing something that is fundamental to the majority of the world population, Genesis 1.28, the notion that we have dominion over nature and that we have the right to exploit the world in which we live, which we have begun to realize way too late and to our cost, is probably not the best possible way of thinking about how to make sense of our interdependence on this planet and our interdependence on one another and on every other species in the environment in which we live. And the last is the pattern of assumptions that decision-making needs to be one or other of a binary, either centralized or decentralized, as a result of which we have thought about but never mainstreamed alternative models of decision-making in governments, like Elinor Ostrom's polycentric governance for the commons, that would help us find a way to braid together public and private value creation, which is exactly what we need now. So the things that we might need to try, or at least speaking from the experience of a practitioner working on the ground to try and affect change in a very short space of time at orders of magnitude of complexity. The first is to design our actions to be coherent, and particularly to design our approaches to innovation and to investment for uncertainty. And that, if I can cite again Gregory Bateson's notion of budgets of possibility, budgets of flexibility. He called them budgets of flexibility, and I'm calling them budgets of possibility, using innovation as the most effective risk management tool for the uncertainty we face, to accelerate our capacity to test, to learn, to build experientially an understanding of how to combine the things that we can come up with and connect them up to the institutions of rulemaking and of behavioral change through law, through policy, through incentives, and through narrative and story about what good looks like and what matters and what well-being is. The second principle is to mobilize resources in such a way that that is coherent. And that's where I would invite you to take a look at the cluster of initiatives. Transformational Capital is one of them, the initiative that we've launched, but there are a number of moves afoot now to think about how could we structurally change the way in which investment participates in transformation, the way in which it supports change. How do we get ourselves out of the magnetic power of looking for single things and deliberately invest in relationships and deliberately invest in combinations and synergies and system dynamics? Systems are capable of changing themselves if we can mobilize ourselves in such a way to do that. The third is what I would describe as the messy middle, paying for orchestration and for implementation. If we really think about where do we need to put our resource, we have a yawning gap between the policy commitments, political commitments to change, whether it's 2050 or 2030, or depending where you are, and a proliferation of solutions that are out there developing, trying to attract capital, working with capitalism and capital markets to see if they can do something in the world. In the middle is a massive gap where those solutions are not joining up. If I look at some of the household names that have come out of the different initiatives in Europe in the last 10 years, or across the world before that, amazing innovations with huge potential, but they're not managing to change the entire infrastructure because they aren't joining up with all of the other elements and pieces of a puzzle that it would take to change whole systems. That big implementation gap doesn't get addressed on its own. It requires an explicit investment in matchmaking, connecting, facilitating, connecting experience to policy, connecting policy learnings and unintended consequences back into feedback loops. That's the work of orchestration and coordination of the many parts that we do already have. And at the moment, we are not paying for that. It doesn't come through programmatic funding. It doesn't come through investment funding. It's the work that everybody knows we need, but that we aren't explicitly putting in a budget line. The fourth principle would be to reverse the risk logic. If I think about the scale and the cost of the risk we face, and I think, for example, about pensions and institutional capital, fiduciary capital, the trillions that we have available in fiduciary capital, that money is to be governed for the optimization of outcomes for pension holders. But we are facing a world where pension holders may find economic and social stability so eroded that it's even difficult to draw down on those funds or to use them or to live in any normal and kind of healthy way. It's a relatively small extension of fiduciary duty if we were to think as institutional, as fiduciary holders, how much, what small percentage of the trillions under management do we invest now in deliberately managed systemic change through innovations to accelerate a managed transition to a different design for human life that allows us to work through and hold that stability through very, very large orders of physical change in the world around us and its effects on food and well-being and health and so on. And by the same token, thinking about the work that is possible when you start to work systemically, the future value of property in a world where we have eliminated polluting emissions, where we have rewilded, where we have used biomimicry and nature-based solutions to create a different relationship with the environment and with one another. The future value and the future increments or orders of magnitude increase in the value of property, why can't we securitize that now and release some of that value now to accelerate our investment in a timely, or at least a more timely way, in accelerating the introduction of those solutions? And the last principle, we will need now to really accept that the transformational challenges in front of us have in very, very large part to do with our use of and our protection of the commons. Access to food, to land, to air quality, to clean water, to sustainable energy, and to a vibrant natural environment and healthy biodiversity. And that means we're going to need an explicit recognition of the importance of designing for public value creation together with public-private value creation, not something that we have really designed ourselves to do for some time, because it would mean reaching into the very heart of our accepted notions and norms around value, departing from core economics and cost-benefit thinking, and rethinking rulemaking for justice, for long-term interests, and for intergenerational responsibilities, the 7-generation rule applied in financial systems. So I'm going to close with a reflection on the fact that the financial services system, like every other major driver of change out there, has one task in the next 10 years, if you look at it from the perspective of somebody on the ground trying to make change happen in the places we live and in the businesses that we use to produce the things we want to live with. We need a design for life that enables 10 billion people to live on this planet sustainably. And for that, we're going to rethink. We're going to need to rethink investment thinking, rethink our definition of value. And if you like, think about how is value driven by values, as Mark Carney describes it. Thank you very much for listening.
Kirsten, thank you very much. Enormous themes and a huge amount for us to think about. I've got a couple of questions that I doubt will do the enormity of what you've just been through justice, but I'm sure people will get in touch to ask you more. I'd like to come back to concrete activities that I know this market may take an interest in, such as your transformational capital programs. It seems like adapting existing structures and information could quickly be brought to make a real difference there. So we'll come on to that. But I just wanted to start with your fundamental hypothesis, and I hope I characterize it fairly, that the capitalism as it currently stands, supported of course by finance, the sources of capital, the owners of capital, is fundamentally misaligned with what you think needs to happen on climate. You're on mute.
Sorry. Yes, I think capitalism, I think the challenge is the assumptions that it rests upon. And some of those assumptions are incredibly difficult to shift because they are assumptions that run as deep as our sense of self in relationship to the world in which we live, our right to exploit, our right to use, our kind of light hold sense of any real responsibility beyond human well-being. I think it is not necessarily that the growth, the commercialization of opportunities is not something that we should pursue, but if we rely exclusively upon that, we rely on two things. The commercialization, the structures and flows of markets will simply not change fast enough for the scale of change we need, not when they are held in thrall with a set of relationships around vested interests, around the relationship between energy, sovereign oil, nation states. We are stuck in a system that has every incentive not to move fast. And secondly, because, as I said, the underpinning assumptions of the whole system is based on things that we know to no longer be effective ways of living if we want 10 billion people to live on the planet. And I think that's one of the very uncomfortable choices. What are we choosing for? That we all survive or that some of us survive? Capitalism might well enable some of us to survive.
And it can be incredibly creative and well-managed capitalism, which doesn't tend towards monopoly. If it's carefully managed, can create new ideas and new technologies and so forth. And I'm sure that it will. I just want to break the idea of capitalism into two parts. One that probably we won't deal with today. So the urge to, for example, to own things, materialism. I don't think the audience here today can change that. But they can perhaps consider the drive for perpetual growth that is embedded in capitalism and a specific remit of, for example, pension funds who need to find a way for people to pay to live between the time they stop working and when they die. That system is predicated on perpetual growth, which is likely then to perpetually consume more resources. So how do we solve that? Because that is driven by financial markets.
Well, for me, that's one of the principal design objects and problems for what we're doing with innovation. How do we solve for ways of living that don't necessarily assume that that is the only way of living well, and that don't fall into black and white differences and simple stories about, well, if it isn't that, then we go back to a world of penury and a world of denialism. I think there are questions. We have an opportunity to learn from the environment in which we live. And there are a richness, there's a huge abundance in our own ingenuity and in the examples around us of what equilibria look like, of what sufficiency looks like, of what symbiosis looks like. There's a huge opportunity for us to start to learn what other design principles could we use in the way in which we think about well-being, prosperity, value, transfer of value over generations, and kind of the norms around life. The problem is we've got some dominant norms about what good looks like, and we're struggling to think outside them and come up with something that is attractive as an alternative. And that's what we need innovation to do, generate those alternatives and generate options so that we aren't dealing with simple stories, we're dealing with more nuanced stories, and we're dealing with choice. One of our challenges, or one of my principal concerns about the way in which our economic structures and our economic thinking function, is that we have abdicated responsibility up to the notion of markets that have forces, tectonic forces, that we can do nothing other than try to manage. We've chosen this system. We've made it. We make it every day, and we remake it every day by the leadership choices, the management choices, the design choices we have. And we can choose to do differently.
Well, the impression I get from listening to the sessions in this symposium over the last couple of days is certainly that governments and regulators and their agents, including central banks, understand that they need to lead markets. So I get the impression that they're moving away from the invisible hand that you talked about and the neoliberal ideas around that, I think people realise that that won't be sufficient to solve these issues in the time they need to be solved. So what would you then ask regulators and governments to do to help correct the version of capitalism and financial markets? What would you ask them to do faster or better in order to modify the things that you think need modifying?
Well, certainly I would ask them to rethink the way, so I would ask them to create a space for exploring alternatives, a real space, not a token space, but a real space. Some of that is about looking at how do we build a common language, the multiple debates around taxonomy, standardization, harmonization. What are some 2 or 3 really core tenets around what we know we would need to design for, around the commons, around the way in which you think about resource flows or the value or the importance of long-term and not just short-term thinking. So reshifting what it is, what takes priority in terms of the design principles we apply. That space of possibility, for example, shifting the logic of investment to a portfolio that is trying to understand how to change whole systems rather than individual solutions on the premise that it needs to be about growth and prosperity within a capital market logic. There are possibilities there. For example, I experienced from inside the financial services system the effect of the Financial Stability Board being given teeth in the wake of the credit crisis and coming up with the idea of systemically important financial services players, too systemically important to fail, therefore subject to a set of special measures in terms of solvency, risk management, and so on. What if we turned around as rulemaking institutions and said these are the value chains that are too systemically important or too systemically impactful in the world not to transform? And the special measures are a requirement to apply the tools, whether it's the TCIF, the combination of disclosure, risk management costs, the release of some funds to accelerate innovation and accelerated innovation testing in these value chains, in these regions of the world, in these food systems. The rulemaking requires special measures to accelerate change. That notion of kind of using our own ways of thinking about risk and risk management and our bias towards equilibria, and use that same notion to help us bias ourselves towards transformation, that would help, because it sets, we know people need signal, money needs signal, it needs to know directionally that's where we're going, and then we can apply our ingenuity to take something, to find the ways there.
And do you think that more should be done in terms of incentives and disincentives? So bank supervisors are looking at capital charges for brown assets and so forth, and that will certainly guide financial markets in the right direction. But is there more that can be done on incentives or rewards to invest in the things that will make a difference to the climate agenda?
Well, I think, of course, the short answer is yes. The question is at what scale, how connected, and what you get is what you ask for. So if the incentive, again, is typing back into incentives for individual things rather than incentives for connected things, then we keep leaving opportunity on the table to synergize or to create relationships or to use the properties of innovations or the materials around us to do more with less. So I think, yes, of course. The challenge is really looking at what are we actually seeking, at what scale of transformation are these incentives operating? Because lots and lots and lots of incremental is just running out of time.
In terms of, again, where governments can set examples or regulators and central banks can make a difference, the principal audience here, what is your attitude to governments issuing green bonds, for example? There are small programs which are growing. The NGEU will be a third of that. 800 billion will be green bonds. But there are problems with taxonomies. There are others saying that as we had yesterday, that green bonds are misleading. It may lead you to think that the issuer is more virtuous than it is, and they may not be fairly priced. What do you think about the growth of those markets? You're on mute.
I deal with complex change. Every piece of the puzzle helps, depending on whether it has virtuous consequences or not. So yes, fantastic. Let's expand them. My concern is, what is the money being spent in? Because if the money that's being channeled through green bonds is still being spent and going back into individual disconnected single point solutions and individual disconnected initiatives, we aren't solving the problem. So it's not just making green bonds and flowing more funds into them. It's what do those bonds invest in and what do they ask for? And how does that money start to incentivize not just the connection of solutions, but the activity, the value-adding activity of putting those connections together and of demanding relationships between active learning on the ground from 30 different initiatives being tried in 1 or 2 or several or 50 cities, connected up then to policy making. We know there are hundreds of examples where we see fabulous innovations will not go to scale because the regulation is still stuck. We can't afford any delays in that. We need to get that intelligence through into the regulatory system. So the question again is, what's the agency of green bonds? It's a piece of the financial architecture. It throws funds into a category. We've got questions around the disclosure, effective disclosure. We've got questions around who's doing that and what are they offsetting to compensate. But really, where is that money then being channeled? To what extent is that a lever for change? How demanding and how far along the kind of the end-to-end risk management logic are green bonds really reaching to say it doesn't just need to be something that looks green or fits a taxonomy category. It needs to connect up with another 3 things, or we're leaving money and time on the table.
Okay. In terms of the regulatory impediments you just mentioned, which kinds of things are they?
Well, for example, energy loads. We haven't really thought about designing. We've designed a world for centralized power, not for distributed micro energy loads, are one of the major issues. Transfer of goods. We haven't really designed a word for biochemistry, for green chemistry, for bioplastics. Sometimes we've got land zoning rules that simply mean something can't be transported between borders. And so all of a sudden, a scale solution cannot scale because you have to go and rework national legislation on what can be carried across land. There's myriads and myriads of examples of well-intentioned legislation solving for one thing that has become obsolete in a world of trying to accelerate multi-dimensional change and multi-dimensional solutions.
Thank you, Kirsty. We're short out of time, but I just want to spend a little bit of time looking at the Transformational Capital Programme and the work that you're doing with cities. What needs to be done to speed that up? So it sounds like you're dealing with lots and lots of existing programs which are being put together, aggregated on a holistic level with a new data layer to look at them all in one go from a climate perspective. That sounds interesting and feasible. What needs to be done to speed that up, and what data is needed, and what's missing?
So 2 things. The work that is partnering with cities, and there's similar work happening with land use, landowners, agricultural systems, and with core materials, cement, steel, plastics, bioindustry. It's all the similar kind of approach. The core principle there is partly getting holistic framework around existing initiatives and connecting them, and partly mapping those initiatives onto the problems, the actual problem spaces for change, and therefore running and hunting for other complementary initiatives. So you've got to basically, it is literally like a dynamic portfolio management, actively looking to plug gaps, to diversify, to connect, but they are real economy, place-based or value chain-based portfolios. So the question is, Madrid needs 10 billion a year to transform, to seek its transformation. The average, the rough economic case suggests that that'll be something like a 32% return on investment. It's not small, but 10 billion a year is massive. And the city has no way of pulling that money in. Investment coming in is looking for individual projects. It's not looking at the whole city, and the fact that if the city moves these initiatives in connected ways, the whole and the return can be much greater than the sum of the parts. The missing pieces are, what would you put a portfolio investment in? What's the receiving vehicle that structures it? What does return look like? What are expectations look like? Who holds the capital? How is the capital deployed then? And an organization like Climate Kick is working on how does that capital then get deployed into the individual initiatives, not as ownership stakes necessarily, but as almost leasing stakes in possible future value or future value creation. But that architecture needs to be built. And that's one of the reasons why we've launched this initiative. It's a call to action to build that architecture. And the next thing that needs to be changed is the assumptions that this is how you can deploy capital, because every conversation that we have reinforces the fact that it's an interesting idea, but beyond the limits of the known world in terms of how investment comes into play.
I'm certain that there will be clever enough people in this audience to help design structures that allow those portfolios to be constructed. So let's end on an optimistic note. It's a fascinating call to arms, Kirsten, and a concrete and real step that we can act on straight away instead of endlessly debating taxonomy, is important though that is. So Kirsten, thank you very much. A fabulous presentation and discussion. We greatly appreciate it. We are now at the end of the symposium. Thank you all for joining. Thank you all to the audience for listening, the wonderful panelists we've had, the important discussions that we've had. We are under no illusion that policymakers are absolutely committed to this area, and regulators too, and financial markets, but there's clearly still a very long way to go, and a lot of definitions, data layers, and taxonomies and so forth still to be sorted out, as well as clever structures to be designed of the type that Kirsten is talking about. So good luck with all that work. Thank you all for joining us, and join us soon on SPI as we explore these issues being developed further. Thank you very much and have a good evening, everyone.